If you can take that moment in time, that self-doubt, figure out why you have that self-doubt, and then move that into something for future use. When you start to doubt yourself in the future about something else, you can be like, wait a minute, this is stupid.
He's the data guy and he wants to have a talk with his business pals while they're off the clock on podcast like a business.
Dude, you have been a wealth of information to me for architecture for years. Like, we started reviewing just books on a property I want to plan. You know, I actually wanted to plan that for this business, to have like a DataLAB retreat, and we'll have like a place to get away. And we've talked about that kind of stuff, but we've also talked about just house architecture. You do commercial buildings, like giant concrete Amazon type buildings, and all the way down to like Metra and what are those called? Those transit systems. Like, I don't even understand how those work, much less, could think about how to sit down and start drawing out how they all intersect. So, man, I appreciate you just taking the time to talk data with me in general. You want to talk a little bit about where you're at now and how you got there? And
I'm actually switching to a new architecture company called HOH Group. It's a full service architecture and engineering firm. And actually, to kind of dive back a little bit into my history, the first firm I was hired at coming out of graduate school was a firm by the name of Greenberg Farrell Architects and Engineers. And it was also a full service firm. Basically, they were focused at the time out of the Chicago location in prototypical restaurant and retail. So if you think like McDonald's, Starbucks, Panda Express, Myers, those kind of just typical rollout architecture. And the idea being that you have a set prototype, a basis of drawings, and from there you can copy and paste, but you then also have to take that building, and when you copy and paste it, you have to now make sure it meets the local zoning codes and building requirements. So it's not as simple as just doing Control-C, Control-V on a computer. After almost, I did 4.5 years there, in which then I was seeking out new opportunities, in which I went to Partners in Design Architects. And that wasn't too far away, in Riverwoods, Illinois. Basically, at that company, I've really got a good handle on industrial and we'll say corporate commercial architecture. So we're talking big box shell buildings for Amazon, different kind of suppliers, that whether it be warehousing, wholesale, retail, down to even just we'll say small businesses. I did a small outpatient therapy center. Something that architects typically do. The general public doesn't even think that architects do. Something, a little therapy clinic. Done a couple little minor school remodels, and even remodeled my house. I mean,
that's awesome. It's nice to be able to use those skills you build and like benefit from them on the daily.
The fun thing about it is with the skills, you get exposure to all kinds of different businesses and all kinds of different ways that people are funding these businesses, whether it's investors, banks. You get a good idea of how businesses are not just structured, but how they're financed. You have the traditional bank model. You have the side of investors, where you might have real estate companies come in. They're looking to develop, basically as developers, and they go get private donor money to help supplement what the banks won't cover. There's also the ability to use some things like what's called TIF funding, and that's federal funds to actually help build some of these buildings. And there's a whole process and timeline with all that. And as an architect, part of my job is to not just design a building that is feasible and that can get built, but also to work with the contractor to make sure we can actually hold the timeline to get it built. Because, for example, with the current state of the industry now, some of the transformers that we need for these larger shell buildings, and I'm talking 150,000 square feet and larger, we're talking 54, 56 weeks minimum for some of these. So your lead time is literally a year out. So
Wow.
in some instances, given the state of everything, and it's not just due to COVID, it's just the state and craziness of suppliers. During COVID, there were some mergers that had happened with acquisitions, and supply chain just got disrupted a little. So now that even though the industry's kind of caught up, we're also heading into an off season for certain materials too.
Wow. So like, is that for buildings that are being planned, or I bet there's some that are in construction that are just now on hold for 56 weeks?
There are, yes. And actually, so when I was leaving Partners in Design, I actually left 3 of my buildings are currently under construction at this time. And these are, like I said, larger shell buildings out of Wisconsin. 2 of the buildings, the precast isn't getting delivered to the site till next spring.
And you can make all the phone calls in the world. You can be as mad as you want to whoever. I mean, it's not like concrete comes from somewhere that, wow, man, I didn't think about the supply chain having that big of a deal. But I guess when you think about all the concrete buildings that are getting poured, that's a lot of concrete and it needs to be shipped. But the transformer thing is actually pretty surprising too, because then even if you get the concrete in place, which to your point could have 20 or 30 weeks of plus or minus lead time, now you've got to get this building built because the concrete comes in, but now you may have 20 weeks of that concrete sitting there just because you can't get electric to the building. And it's not like you can do anything until, wow, I didn't realize it was all stacking like that. Like I knew that there was delays, right? But like I never really thought about how, because I see cement buildings all over the place that are just empty and been cast and they're sitting there. And I'm like, what are they doing? I bet it's very similar stuff. They're waiting on parts and timelines.
It is. And actually, in the case of one of my buildings currently, the developer decided to purchase all the roof insulation in advance because they're afraid of rate spikes coming into the spring. Well, unfortunately, with roofing insulation, you can't leave it out exposed to the elements right now. And this is one of them. Their precast isn't showing up till the spring. So they actually had to run some numbers and look at, do they rent a building and store all this in, or do they rent trailers to transfer from a trailer to a new trailer and store it that way? They actually came across that the trailer option is going to be best. And for them, it's 19 trailers that they are renting until, we'll say probably April, May timeframe.
And they just park them right on the property, right? It'll just look like a bunch of trucks just sitting there, and it is. It's full of all the roofing insulation.
Exactly. That's the plan. Yeah.
That's so wild. And I bet that's happening all over the country, like that's crazy.
As an architect, it's not just designing buildings, it's also coordination with the contractors, the owners, any kind of consultant, that kind of stuff. It's a much bigger realm. So in terms of dealing with data,
projects going on at once too, and a lot of different clients too, which is
exactly. So you nailed it there, Rob.
And you do both. You go from like, hey, today I'm designing a subway, tomorrow I'm doing a school, and then the next day is a house, or is it generally kind of the same thing? Or
so typically with projects, they're a little bit longer term. And what I mean by that is that typical workflow for a project coming in, we'll just say it's a new building, right? The client comes in, we talk with them and stuff. It's if you think about it, it's a first date. We're trying to entice the client for their business. They're trying to entice us to make sure we're the cheapest or the best or whatever their parameters are.
Right.
And at the end of it, you're hoping to sign a contracted deal. So once that deal is signed, you start initial conversations. And sometimes we might do a little bit of schematic, just showing them, hey, we've done some background research. Here's what we think could go on your site and things. But a lot of that, if you think about it, again, it's a first date. Once we actually have a signed contract, it gives us stipulations of what we will and will not be doing in terms of their project. And it clearly outlines our basically tasks that we need to do. So in a typical project, we'll say developing a shell building, the client will come in and say, we have a land agreement with this owner for this parcel of land. So we'll then contact our civil people and our civil engineers and just say, hey, client has such and such land. Here's the parcel ID number. Can you get us anything CAD related to it? You can. And they'll kind of go through their channels to actually pull the CAD if the client doesn't already have that. And CAD being basically the background, the line work in we'll say a computer coded program that's based around the intent to design.
Similar to those images you showed at the beginning, those kinds of like the drawings of what's going to happen. And that's the law, right? Like from once you draw that and you sign it, all those contractors are basically just following step by step what's happening in that plan, right?
In a way. I mean, so we are with that plan, we are outlining what is code, but we're not necessarily outlining means and methods of construction. Now, I'll get there in a moment here.
Oh, sure.
But with the CAD, the computer aided drafting program, we will then kind of just lay out the building, lay out the site, go through a couple of iterations. All that's kind of considered schematic design. When the client gives us a yes, let's make this happen, that's when we move into really design development and eventually construction drawings. And that is your classic, here's your 10 or 20 page drawing set outlining everything from foundations, wall sections, elevations, your interior floor and roof plans, your ceiling plans. And there it also covered your engineering drawings, such as civil, structural, electrical, mechanical, plumbing. In certain situations, the client might have, we'll say, racking or refrigeration layout plans. When I was working on Myers years ago, we used to have those included in our set. And it basically told your MEP contractors where they had to put future stub-ins for the refrigeration units going. Because if you think about refrigeration, you have moisture. You have, in some cases, a frozen section. So any of that ice or that moisture, the condensate that comes down off of your coolers and freezers, they have to hit drains and actually get out. You don't want that on your floors. So, it's so many. You're thinking about the fluids inside of the pipes that you're installing in a building that doesn't exist. Because right now it's a field. Yes. And if you don't, it will be a problem later. Yes. And in some cases, it's not just a field. It is literally a field that farmers can't even farm because it is either too hilly, too wet. There might be existing ponds or in some cases strip mining in this area that has happened. Wow. And it is sometimes not the ideal conditions that we are developing.
I know you were talking about some of the new stuff you were looking at downtown is like the subway systems where you have to go and like fix something there. Just walking into something like that. I like how you take it, but you break it apart and make it simple. But man, I would be overwhelmed walking into something like that. Yeah.
Well, and that's kind of more of a, we'll say an existing building program, right. That's where as an architect, I go in and I'm looking for things that, it kind of, if you think about it, kind of like getting a home inspection when you're going to purchase a home. It's in a way I'm going in and looking for specific items that need to be fixed, either brought up to code or the client's asking us to take a look at to fix, or while I'm there, I happen to notice, hey, you got a crack in this foundation wall that we need evaluated. So that kind of starts that conversation. With an existing building program, while the building exists, the site already exists, there sometimes are additions, alterations, and all this has definitive legal terms that we have to abide by. For example, if I'm going to take your house and increase it by 50% of the existing size, that type of a building addition kicks in certain requirements within the residential building code, especially the existing building code, if it's been adopted in certain jurisdictions. For example, California, you now might be required fire sprinklers for your house, or at least that addition portion, basically because you went above a threshold. And like I said, the code would actually, that has been adopted by that state, would outline exactly what that threshold is.
It sounds like most of your job is data-driven in some capacity or another. I mean, talking about the logistics of shipping to storage, talking about warehousing, cost analysis of different materials. I'm sure there are alternatives that you use sometimes when people need to build these things and don't have the money. Is there a point in your career where it kind of clicked and you realized all of this is just crunching numbers, or at least the vast majority of it is data?
I would say, honestly, in school, it was pretty much in our face from, I would say, day one of design studio, that this is a data-driven field. One of the things they teach in architecture school is the idea of schematic layout and design. We'll say, even break it down as simple as bubble diagrams. And it's as simple as saying, hey, with looking at a house, when you enter in through the main entry, are you going to come into a foyer or are you going to come into a mudroom? What is that connected to? So you start drawing your lines or your arrows that's connecting each of these rooms. And that's basically your initial data that is being given and laid out. But actually, I would say before that, I kind of had a feeling that life was more about data. And to step back here, it was really seeing my dad teach himself Excel years and years ago. So the story is, my father used to work for Dean Foods, and this is out of Louisville, Kentucky. And it basically, the plant he worked in, they did cottage cheese and milk production. So he was moving from the warehouse, the production side, the bottling and production side, into, we'll say, office management. And really, office management really doesn't describe it. It's more or less tracking orders that's been fulfilled and informing the state as well as the company what has been fulfilled and where things are going. Should a recall or anything have to happen? These are things we don't think about it as individuals on a day-to-day basis. So I remember, this was late 90s. I was probably 8, 9 years old at the time. And wow. I remember it is old compact 96 computer, and it is in the old room we used to call the playroom, then got renamed to the computer room. And he was there kind of working and working through these Excel spreadsheets he was learning. But at the same time, he was trying to take we'll say the more simple data that they had from the different production lines. So we'll say like your production unit numbers. And he was trying to get the sheets to cross-reference to pull from 2 or 3 sheets into one to simplify his job daily. Yep. Because it's just something, if you don't think about it, one line is, okay, here's everything we produced in the day, and it's going to sit in the warehouse possibly a day or two. And yes. Then the shipping side is, okay, here's all the call numbers of the pallets that we're putting on this truck. And then you have your shipping receiving office that has a spreadsheet that just says, here's all the trucks that went out and where they're headed.
Yep.
So that there's all that kind of information that they had to keep track of. So anyways, like I said, he was doing it. And then to even take it a step further, so years ago, my father, he coached baseball for my brother and I. And he was a man that loved sports. And I wish he was still with us today. But he had this talent of not just coaching, but he would be out there on first base coaching and giving signals to the third base coach to give us batting signals, but at the same time keeping a detailed book of the game. And in the scorebook, he wasn't just keeping data like outs or RBIs and stuff. He was tracking where kids were hitting the ball. He was tracking those kind of metrics.
Moneyball before it was Moneyball.
Exactly. So then he could go home and take this in Excel and figure out not just simple batting averages, but we're talking about being able to predict, let's say, the second time at bat, I am 80% likely to strike out. That's a metric they can use to fix and adjust the batting lineup just slightly. We're talking switch 1 or 2 kids so that you don't have a runner stranded on a base.
Yep.
It's that kind of data and metrics. So like I said, that is where it really clicked with me when I was younger. Life is about data. Definitely coming up through school, high school, Algebra 1, Algebra 2 class, definitely geometry. I picked up right on it right away. Data, everything, especially when you start dealing with variables. And then, like I said, to kind of finally come back to the college idea, it was really at college that it started clicking for me. And then in sophomore year, I took a class ran by Autodesk University. They came to Ball State University where I went to school. And they actually did a training on a program called Revit. And that's, I would say, when it clicked with me, it's not just in my mind that it's about data. Architecture is solely about data. And this program is so, we'll say, it is so advanced that I've been using it for 10 years, 12 years now, and I still have not fully mastered the full intent of this program. Everything is what they call a parameter inside the program. And that, if you think about that, that's a little algebraic data or equation or name or number. And what that does is that allows you to say, I want this item linked to this item using this equation.
It's so cool you do it that, man. I've seen it before in like Blender for video game design, and in like Unity for when I make like special effects. It's node based like that. I never in a million years thought that architects would use it, but why not? Like, it's the same kind of, because those parameters are what you really are changing by jurisdiction. You know, the steel itself isn't going to change much, but like what one state wants versus another, it's way easier to have one point of reference of that instead of all over your document.
Yes.
That's amazing though, man. And I love how you simplify the process by using the tool the right way.
Yes. And I mean, it's in many cases, the family has what's called, the program has what's called families. And it basically is, if you think it's a component that you copy and paste into the file. We'll say a family for furniture, right? But what the parameter allows you to do is it allows you to change the dynamics of that in real time. So
that's freaking neat.
I could set up a parameter with the table, paste it in, and say, okay, well, I don't think a 4-foot table looks good. If it's set up correctly, you don't have to reload a 5-foot table in. You can just sit there and change the parameter to I want a 5-foot table, and it will show you roughly what a 5-foot table would look like. And I mean, it's not exact, of course. It's not necessarily the table a manufacturer would provide. There are ways that we can do that with the families to have that exact item. But the idea is that it allows me to see in real time, and even discussing with the client, we want to start shifting some things around. It's this simple. And kind of as we kind of have discussed, Rob, it's where I'm hopefully headed more in diving into this. You know, it's not just drawing simple walls and things that I use the program for, but actually to be able to control it more in real time so that we can see multiple iterations, you know, in a given presentation.
That's freaking cool with the Revit. Now, that's just one kind of data. That's just your architecture data. You also manage all these projects. I'm assuming that's a whole nother system or software you use just for that type of data. And you probably manage budgets and stuff too. Maybe that's the same or another. How do you balance all those different tools? And you know what I mean? Like, where do I go to this? Is it more of a schedule thing? Is it time of day thing? Is it time of week or month or whatever? I don't know.
Yes. So I'm going to kind of generalize here, but in most architecture firms, you will have some kind of, it's typically like an Excel spreadsheet. It's tracking all your projects at that given time. You know, we'll say potential projects, potential leads, down to existing projects. Where are they in, we'll say schematic design, design development, construction documents, down to is it being built and under construction administration. It's, to simplify it, you might have your billing account number, your project name for that account, maybe a couple notes in terms of who the point of contacts are, such as the owner of the site, the developer, the contractor, if there is one at that time, maybe some consultants. And then you have just kind of general notes in terms of colors or even just notations of timeframes for things like, for the next 4 weeks, we're going to be working on construction drawings for this project versus go one line down, and this project currently is awaiting owner response. So that's large scale. Yeah. As far as budgets, most of us use some kind of a we'll say time management system. A Jira being one of them that is heavily used in our industry. And it allows us to set up a project number, bill time to that project number, and then we can just run simple reports to be able to look at it and just say, okay, we're a little bit over on schematic design, but we can make notes and say, well, our client wants to do this additional service, so we need to break that time out and bill accordingly. So
dude, you just that allows us IT to do project too. It's so cool. You use the same software and it's set up the same way, right? Because like, I didn't expect you to use Jira. Honestly, I thought you'd have some like super special accounting Jira, but it's the same thing. Why reinvent the wheel?
Yeah, there are some that do exist specific towards architecture firms, but the 2 companies I've been at so far, it's always been a Jira. They pretty much HR companies come in and speak highly about the program. And I mean, there are limitations. It's not perfect for what we do. especially on the phases that we have to track. There's typically something additional that management has to do to actually set up the phases properly in a JIRA. But with that, another counterpart, the idea of phases being set up automatically, you can have a preset list of phases in it. So basically every project automatically has the phases you need built in.
It's so transferable. You know what I mean? That's what I think we're going to find. I didn't expect you to tell an Excel story, by the way. Hashtag not sponsored, but affiliate links in the description for sure for Excel. I mean, I'm a big Excel user, and the majority of times when I come back to it, I say it in a spreadsheet. It's just easier to put it in rows and columns for me. Even if it's a Word document, sometimes I'm like, let's split up this paragraph, and what are we even talking about? And I love that you use that too. But what's so cool to me is that was just your inspiration. It was how you got started, and now you've moved on to these like node-based advanced flow systems that I would use to make big explosions in video games, and you do the exact opposite, keep buildings together on the ground in real life. So
now side note, there is a side of architecture called forensics architecture where they do that concept that you do, Rob, where you see how a building might have failed.
Sure, like how it fell down.
Exactly.
Yeah, true.
And if you think about it, so the military and government would likely have that kind of engineering built in, probably by outside consultants, I would suggest, but that would not just check the buildings that are being built on their behalf, but possibly be, we'll say threat analysis. That is a whole other side of architecture and engineering, is the threat analysis, especially, I hate to say it, but in the world we live in today, the idea of protecting schools, government facilities, that it's not just about putting the right type of glass in and the bollards out front that keep cars from getting close. It's also about what other threats could potentially happen. And like I said, that's a whole nother side of architecture in terms of consulting, that there are architects, especially with much more military background and experience, can get into.
That's got to be a pretty detailed career path.
So if we can, let's take a step back here real quick, Travis. Okay. Who is Travis Miller, and what does your day-to-day look like? Like what data do you work with daily? How does your day look? Like where did your passion for your career come from? Because the way that you talk about it, man, it's like you were built to be an architect.
Okay, so, well, to start, I'm Travis Miller. I am a senior project architect with HOH Group, Architects and Engineers out of Schaumburg, Illinois. But for the sake of the conversation today, I'm discussing the concept of architect and architecture. As far as how I got started, years and years ago, played with a lot of Legos, a lot of Connects, and did a lot of sketching of houses. Don't ask me why, it was just an interest. To the point where, as opposed to building a physical model out of Lego, I would more likely take the base plate and outline the rooms, because it was quicker, simpler, and it got the point across for free play. So it was a whole fun time growing up. And as I was growing up, I really found this enjoyment of the built environment. And that's really was the driving factor. My dad had a little bit, I kind of discussed with his experience with Dean Foods. Before that, he worked for a cabinetry company that did cabinetry and glass. And actually after Dean Foods, there was a round of layoffs, unfortunately, years ago, and he was impacted. He actually went to a door manufacturer. And there they were actually using CNC routers to do custom millwork on doors. So like I said, I've kind of always been exposed to it. I have several uncles that's either, well, one's an electrician, two that do cabinetry, several that have done, just various, we'll say, working with their hands over the years. So I've kind of always been exposed to the idea of building in the built environment, we'll say. But for me, it was more about the interest in laying out the building, seeing how people interact. And I was more the higher level thinking of if you did this differently, how would it change the look? So I'd say that was a major driving factor of me doing architecture. At one point in time, I was very, very close to becoming a structural engineer. The two schools that I got accepted to was University of Louisville, the Structural Engineering Speed School, and Ball State University for architecture. And I was submitting my portfolio for Ball State University, and I was at a FedEx Kinko's in downtown Louisville, and I ran into what was called at that time a plans runner, or basically delivery service for building plans. And he put me in contact with a local architect that's literally on a Sunday night after his kids went to bed, had an hour-and-a-half conversation with me about the differences of architecture and engineering. And that made me, from that point forward, say, I want to be an architect. And it was basically how he explained it, the idea that structural engineers and other engineers are very much about the finite details, keeping a building standing. But while some do, most do not control, we'll say, a building project in the way the buildings are actually designed. What I was looking for is more of an architect, where we work with the client to design the layout of the building, help oversee it getting built. We deal with the day-to-day nuances of construction, dealing with contractors, answering RFIs, RFPs, so requests for information, requests for proposals, change orders, those kind of things. So that's kind of what got me into it. There are some days where I might have 4 different sketches for potential tenants that need to get out for these shell buildings. There are other days that it is literally me working on construction drawing sets for 1 client or 2, potentially. And there's other days that it's complete chaos and it's a little bit of mixture of everything. But generally speaking, I start with the site, pull together schematic design, show the roads and buildings and everything to kind of start coordinating the discussion between the other disciplines. I, as an architect, am, if you think of it this way, a leader of the other disciplines. Not that they don't contribute. There is discussion that happens back and forth, but when you hire an architect, you're hiring someone that can see the finished product in their mind and will coordinate between civil and structural, mechanical, electrical, engineering, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. There's also, like I said, refrigeration, sometimes a high hazard consultant. There's all these other disciplines that might get brought into it. And we have to know basically what each of them do. We don't necessarily know every little information in the drawings, but we have to know where we can find it and to make sure that it's coordinated. And it's if you think of it this way, it's almost in a way mimicking as a pre-check to what the contractor would do. Because when a contractor goes and builds this, they're traditionally going to start with foundations, then put up your walls, then start putting up your roofing to basically enclose the building shell. Then while that building shell is up, then they can worry about things of building the exterior walls, such as like any kind of finite details, to then also the interior side. And this is where the coordination comes in, because we have to know typically, what's the progress of things. It's typically going to be plumbing and mechanical, if not overlapping, kind of happening very near in tandem. Basically, because those are the 2 toughest things. There's a lot of cutting that has to do anytime you make a downturn or turn it around a corner, versus electrical is one of the last things to always go in. Because electrical wiring is very simple to do. Yes, there is conduit now that we have to provide as part of the building code, but in the scheme of things, it's much easier to round the conduit around the plumbing in the walls and around the ducts in the walls or the ceiling than it is to do it the other way around. So, like I said, it's day-to-day, it's a bunch of coordination. The other thing I deal with is basically keeping clients happy. It sounds funny to say it, but I do work with a lot of different developers, and these developers, they come in and they're very gung-ho about get this building done, and we'll pull together basic plans and elevations for them to get their initial approval, get the buy-in of their investors. And then when they say go, we basically have to jump and go. They're expecting it. It was due last week when they say go, unfortunately. So
tell them the 56 weight for electrical probably doesn't go over well all the time. There's got to be some finesse to that.
It is never ideal to tell them the weights, but most of them have been in the industry long enough. They get it, which is why they're like, hurry up and get it done so we can place the order for the units we need.
Let's start the clock.
Exactly. There's building code research that I have to do. So one of the things that people don't realize is architects, you have to abide by not just building codes, but also zoning codes. In zoning codes, there's typically, there's a couple that we always look at. The biggest is the bulk zoning requirements for what your parcel is currently or will be zoned when you're putting the said building on it. So give you an example. Rob, you're talking about the idea that you might want a microgreens business somewhere in the future,
yeah,
right?
So I've already even talked about that on the channel. So like we know that there's a small thing in my house, but one thing that was cool with you and I is even if it's just my small 1/10 that I'm doing now for experiments, if I put that on another property in another building and open up a microgreens education center, maybe have some places where people could stay on a property, you knew ways to say, oh yeah, we can lay this out this way and then we can build this now and this later. And what was great is I even sent you like that sample property and said, hey, here's a random address. And you're like, hold on, give me 3 seconds. And within just minutes, you were like, here's where the water flows. Here's where the elevation is. Here's where people have had problems with water and trees before. And I mean, like, that is invaluable. Like, you don't build without a good foundation, and you don't put a foundation until you know what's underneath it. And within seconds, you're able to go look up just what's available publicly. Not even the cool stuff you have, architecture software-wise that tells you 100-year flood and whatever all that stuff is. But yeah, it was just really interesting to me, the value of the pre-research and just how much must go into some of these huge projects. Like
exactly. And even some of the pre-research is even what was your building and parking setbacks for a business. You don't think about it, but if you have a property that is, we'll say 150 feet deep, and you have a 30-foot parking setback and a 50-foot building setback on the front, okay, you have now cut your building back 50 feet. So you now have, we'll say 100 feet left at 150 feet deep parcel. Let's say the rear setback is 30 feet, right? So that leaves you, 70 feet deep max your building can be. Yep. So those are things that we as architects deal with data on a daily basis, is that what is the front, side, rear setback. Sometimes they come in fun little formulas, such as a lot of cities, especially up in Wisconsin, are moving more towards the method now. They'll say a side yard setback, we'll say 5-foot minimum. However, the two sides need to be a minimum of, we'll say 30 feet. So you can have you basically shift your building to be within 5 feet of your property line on one side, but the setbacks on both sides have to equal minimally 30 feet.
Go put that in a parameter, right?
Yeah, I know.
A little bit more work done on that.
People don't think about like the idea that there's shoreline setbacks. If your property abuts a creek or a river, you have to set back from that. And it's not just because, okay, the soils might be sand or bad clay and wash away. It's also because of watershed and the way our water table moves. You don't want, we'll say, hazardous products coming off your building, entering into the soils, and then flowing into the river. Yes, it kind of does when you build that close, but the idea is that any kind of water runoff from your roof at least tries to get in the ground and at least under the river, so that at least it doesn't contaminate the initial waterway.
Right. And water's first, right? Like that's the first thing you got to look at.
So it sounds like there's just a ridiculous amount of parameters that you have to follow at any one time.
Yes.
It sounds like he's hunting them too. It's like nobody comes and just says, here's your 6 parameters. They come with the building and you're like, it sounds like there's 50 parameters I've got to find from the county, from the building, from the client, from the manufacturers, from the, you right, Ryan? Or what
yeah. And so I was going to bring that around and say, how do you keep up with all of it? Like, I know for my position, I work in marketing, and every 2 weeks I'm taking a new seminar. I'm watching somebody's video. I'm taking a new course. I'm trying a new thing. I have to actively be in it all the time. But obviously, as an architect, it's not like you can build infinity buildings to test things.
Yes. So I will say some things are rule of thumb. If I want daylight to go a set distance into a building, there's a rule of thumb in terms of calculating for winter based on where you're at. In terms of if I get it right here, your latitude, your north-south direction in terms of distance from the equator. There is a equation that you can run based on where you sit that will tell you, based on the degree for winter and summer, how tall your windows are going to be and how far that light will go into building. That's one example of things that we have documented. For things that are, we'll say, zoning and building code, you learn and you remember a lot of it. Yes, we still always go back and verify, but that's pretty constant. There's states like Wisconsin, Indiana, Florida, California. They all have a state unified building code. States like Illinois gets a little bit more challenging. We have certain parts of code like energy code that is unified, but the actual building code, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, those are actually per jurisdiction that has authority. So what we often refer to as AHJs, or authorities having jurisdiction. For example, Chicago has their own Chicago building code. But if I move out to, we'll say, Gurnee area, where Rob and I are near, Gurnee has a different set of building codes and standards. It's still, we'll say, current, but it's not necessarily a 2018 version. It might be a 2012 version of the code. And the minor differences might affect certain buildings, it might not. It basically depends on when it was adopted. And likewise, at the states that do have a unified building code for that state, it might be a couple years out of date. They only update them every 3, 5, 10 years. It just depends on when that cycle comes up, or in case of a few states, their building code only gets updated whenever a bunch of people in their state Congress get together and say, we need to update it. So they could theoretically be 20 years out of distance of whatever the current code model is for what their basis is. Years ago, I did a internship with the Indianapolis Zoning and Planning Department. And they were at that time trying to revamp the zoning codes for the city of Indianapolis. And these codes were something like 1950, 1960 timeframe when they were established. So they didn't address anything like the idea of mixed-use buildings. They didn't address the idea of wind turbines or solar panels on top of buildings, or even houses for that matter.
Wow.
So in order to stop having to do all these special approvals, they realized they need to update the code. And there was this whole effort. They received government funding to do so because, it was a multi-year effort that they had to undertake. And I was only with them for a small amount of time and doing a very small role there, basically as an intern. But yeah, it can be a very elaborate process. So to kind of cycle back, Ryan, in our project folders, we try to keep copies of at least what the bulk building requirements are so we can reference them. Like I said, also in that we'll just typically note whatever the current codes are. And like I said, what some of the typical ones is like 2012 IBC, International Building Code. That's a very typical one. We expect that there's going to be local or state amendments. And then we just got to track down what they are and does any apply to us directly.
It makes a lot of sense. It does sound like there could definitely be some landmines that you're walking around, though, depending on where you're at and what you're building.
Yes, and some do catch us. We are not perfect. We don't catch them all. Okay, so anyways, I was doing this restaurant years and years ago, and this was one of the prototypical rollout ones. We did our initial code research. I remember because I had done the code research for this thing. Spotted all the potential landmines. We had actually already done 2 other restaurants in the state of Indiana at that time. And submit the drawings through the state review process, and we get this review comment back, and it completely blindsided all of us. And the comment was simply, in the state of Indiana, openings to bars cannot be larger than, I think it was 6 feet or something like that at the time. I believe they have did away with it since then. And if you look at our drawings, it's exactly 6 feet open.
Oh.
So our contractor on the millwork made sure the opening was into the into that 6 foot opening, so it's not 6 feet. Like arbitrary. You can't
Like
see
a
the
little
landmark.
quarter inch
Right.
of wood on each
I
side, and now
mean-
it's 5 feet, 0.75.
I mean, and at that time, the sign-in sealer, she comes back and she goes, how have we never encountered this on any of the other? And like I said, we had already done, I know of 3, maybe even 4 in the state of Indiana within that past 2-year time period. And it's one of those, it's like, of all things, who would have thought? Another one, and this is one we caught because we were aware that the state was a little bit more prohibitive on alcohol. But into the bar area, you typically walk into something like, we'll say like a Texas Roadhouse, a TGI Fridays, you think like a Buffalo Wild Wings, those kind of establishments. You walk in, you get greeted, you go to sit down, and they typically have the higher walls that you sit in when you're in the booth. And then they're typically open above it, except now that COVID happened,
Right, until COVID, all those plastic things everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, the plastic
They're like
things.
slightly higher than your head, right? Enough
Well,
that you're
exactly,
creating
but
a booth.
Exactly, you're creating a booth, but keep in mind they're all clear, and basically you can see above, and in most cases you can see directly into the bar area. You can see people having a drink at the bar. Well, in this state, they had a rule: you could not, you had to visually block the view into the bar area. Okay, it was to protect kids from drinking. Okay.
So kids couldn't see people drink in the bar, and therefore it was safe. Now, they could walk into the bar and watch them drink as they walked in, as long as when they sat down, they weren't staring at me polishing off my 3rd beer.
Well, more or less, when they even walked in, theoretically, like for here, we actually had to add swinging doors. Like think your old Western dual swinging doors to walk in for this. And I mean, for the restaurant, it fit the core. They're like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, you just lean into it, right?
They leaned into it, but we'll say the irony of the whole situation is that the state just required a material to block, as they put it, block the airflow so that you couldn't even smell the beer. And I wasn't actually directly on the project. I remember, though, at the time that the architect who was, and he asked them the question. He said, is this any material so as long as you stop the airflow? And they said, yes. He said, I just want to clarify. So we can put a glass panel above.
Yeah.
And it suffices. And they're like, yes. It's like, but with the glass panel, we can still see the bar. We can still see people drinking.
But that's fine now. Now it's safe.
I mean, like what? And it's just like, I mean, so those are typically what we encounter. There is the occasional, contractor, put the footing in the wrong place, or the building's slightly skewed or something. That happens. But I mean, the fun ones are always the ones, like I said, like this. You just remember it's like, who came up with that code? I mean, it's almost like somebody coming up with a law like 200 years ago that, it's illegal on a Sunday to be drunk riding horseback or something. It's that kind of equivalency for some of these. So, like I said, those are always fun ones. We do occasionally get other roadblocks by, we'll say, suppliers, especially your utility companies. A big one right now is there's a utility company, especially out of Wisconsin, that they are really pushing back where and how far the electrical meters and boxes are from the building front, and they have reason to. I mean, it's their logic makes sense on it, but it does change how some of these buildings that were developed years ago are now being developed. So, and it does change things as far as like your docks or drive-in doors in some cases, or your additional green space requirements. And actually, speaking of green space, that's another one I deal with regularly. Within your bulk zoning codes, you're always going to have a minimum amount of green space or a listed maximum amount of impervious area. It's always phrased one way or the other. And I will just say that I was dealing with a city where it was phrased as green space, but I actually had to come up with an Excel spreadsheet because we were doing a solidified site agreement, basically site master plan, where you'd have multiple buildings on site. And we were proving to them that while building number one and site number one, that's all part of that plan, might not meet the green space requirements, the entire development as a whole would. And that was another landmine, the fact of having to explain that and build that out, and basically you calculate your building, your amount of paid parking areas, your down to on the green space side, how much detention ponds are you going to have, how much grass are you going to have. In this case, we were able to use permeable pavers. And then basically all that output a number based on the site area that told me whether or not I had met the green space requirement. And if I didn't, I then had to have a whole nother column that literally was a calculation where I took the total impervious area, made that effectively 75% of a whole, and that calculation told me how much more land area I needed to make it whole.
Wild.
So, and basically that amongst at that time, it was 3 different phases. It's now a 2-phase site plan with 2 buildings effectively. But basically it kicked out a number, and the phase 1 and phase 2 at that time were needing something that was like 20,000 square feet additional green space combined. The phase 3 area, we had like an excess of 50-some thousand square foot of green space. So then it shows a final tabulated column that says, here's your total site area, here's your total building, impervious, here's your green space, and the breakdown of what qualifies for that. And then it basically tabulated and said, we still have an excess of this amount of green space above and beyond your 25% threshold.
So awesome how this random Excel column just flags everything for you and simplifies it. I can't tell you how many industries that's common in. Everybody I know, they have this special calculation, and the column will determine, is this good or not good, or how much more that I need. But that green space is all relatively new too, right? When did that all start becoming a thing? Because you talk about stuff going back to 2018 or 2012 or.
Well, I mean, the idea of green space, I would say really turn of the century. And of course, I mean, I was young. I can't definitively point a finger on it, but I would say based on just my experience in the industry and just knowing how building and zoning codes have developed, turn of the century coming into the 2000s, that at that time, there was a real pushback of this beginning idea of a green movement. And at that time, the green movement was more about re-embracing the idea of nature. That's really when a lot of research was going into nature-based education and the ideas of what could nature-based therapy do in terms of a person's psychosis, and as far as non-medical treatment methods. And again, it's kind of started getting absorbed, and to the point now where cities are actually putting in requirements for bird-safe glazing. And it's basically dots or patterns on the glass. In some cases, it's a UV film. And that UV film, with polarized sunglasses or a certain way the light hits and casts shadows, you'll see the film effectively. But more importantly, the birds and animals are starting to see that. So you don't have deer that's running through your front door that's all glass because the sun is just shining right and they don't see the glass. Or you don't have birds flying into skyscrapers is the idea.
Wow.
And basically trying to help impact the environment basically through what we can actually control as humans.
I know you said the impervious stuff too. That actually just called out to me because my dad did a lot of the flood management in Lake County when I was a kid, and he would have to get out and measure the rivers and see what's there and how deep is it, because then they'd have to put sandbags. But I know recently, at least in all of America I've seen, they really have to plan, if you're going to build this much, you have to have so much space set aside just to collect the water runoff itself. And then this whole green space initiative too adds even more to that, I got to think, if not probably related, like you're saying. Wow, that's wild. But it solved a huge problem for him. We used to have flooding everywhere, and we still get it, but it's nowhere near what it used to be years ago. Wild, man. I didn't think about having that be a column in a spreadsheet though that some architect cares about, I guess it makes sense, but.
Well, and while I don't deal directly with them on these larger projects. Civil does have to deal, like in the case of Wisconsin, a lot of my projects had to go through the Army Corps of Engineers to not just certify floodplains, but to certify that watershed and where's that water going. There's a couple of them have wetlands nearby, so they also had to go through. There's a couple of like FEMA regulations they had to go through, as well as the wildlife management offices, both state and federal. So keep in mind it can be a drawn out process. While I might be able to, in 4 to 6 weeks for some of these shell buildings, get a full drawing set pulled together and submitted to the state, we're talking it could be 6 weeks before you have architectural approval, or longer in some cases for these larger buildings. And in some cases for the civil side, it could be 3 or 4 months. It could be longer if you have to answer questions about it. And the thing is we always have to expect you're going to get a question, coming back from the reviewer. And the question, and really for us, the big question is on our side is, are we going to get the question before the due date of the review or at the due date? Because if they give it to us before, we can usually answer it and by the due date of, we will officially have your stuff reviewed by this day, they can usually issue the permits or whatever. But in some cases, it's at that due date, you get issued questions, and now you have 30 days to respond. Or it might say you have 15 business days.
Or something.
Yeah, and
some people have to meet to even have the question come up, and then you have to wait then you can answer it. You still have to wait to the next meeting to answer it, because they're not ready to hear it that night, even if you're ready, right?
And on some of these, you require zoning and planning approval, or in some instances, you actually have to go in and have public hearings. It
like
kind of sounds
general,
funny.
like open to anybody, not just like people can come in and complain about your building. Not like you're going to the government and people can hear about it. You're saying like, I want to put this here, and residents who live around you could just come and be like, you're an idiot. I hate your ideas. I don't like for mine. You and I were actually talking about that with campgrounds. Sometimes people don't like it because they're like, people might stay up late and party. You have to actually look at zones where they don't mind you having people have late night. And that blew my mind. I had to think about buying this land and then appease everybody who lives around it immediately.
Well, so like in urban environments, it's typically everybody within, we'll say 1,000 feet or something of the property gets automatic notices that have to be certified mailed and said, hey, public notice, this hearing's happened. But in some rural cases, it could be everybody that lives on that road, because it might be a 1-lane road going, basically it's a 2-lane road, 1 lane going both ways without a center line.
Yep.
So everybody on that road has the ability to come in and give input. And in some developers' cases, there might be funding that they have to provide up front, or we'll say improvements they have to make that is then turned over to the city for upkeep, or the county. I've actually encountered a few where the developer put in the intersection with the streetlights as a means of, this is what we are providing as their agreement. And then when the building is officially commissioned and signed and said you're officially open and you can get tenants in the building, or for the matter, you can occupy the building, then the city basically acquires that public right-of-way area with the improvements and then now has to maintain it.
Yay.
So there is deals that happen like that. And like I said, it is a myriad of all these. You never know what to expect. I mean,
and I know we're running up on time here, but dude, you even talked to me about like how people get government money and want to build a $500,000 building, and then they can go get money from the government to do that because they're improving this land that was, like you said, strip mined or otherwise useless for people.
Yes.
And the government's like, oh, we have money set aside for that. And it's just fascinating to have somebody like you available for, to reach out and help. I do try to beg everybody who comes on the show to join the Discord. So if people want to ask you questions, they can just, for sure. Awesome. Yay, sucker. Another one bites the dust and the Discord grows.
Yeah. I will say I was an auditor of your program. So the viewers know, Rob, as an auditor of your class that you pulled together. And it was definitely, class worth sitting through. I really enjoyed it. You did a great job.
You raced through. You were the first one to finish it. And what was great is you came out with a business idea right out of there too. And I loved it. And all the corrections and help. Thank you so much for your help on it, man. And that's what it takes, is people going through and learning with me. So thank you for that.
Speaking of going through and learning, I want to just, I guess before we come up on time when we wrap up here a little bit, Travis, Do you deal with imposter syndrome in your professional life, and how do you deal with that? I'm sure there are a lot of people that will eventually listen who want to get into architecture or building management or anything even tangentially related to what you're doing. And I know for me, at least, imposter syndrome is literally my daily. Like, I wake up and I make memes for people on Facebook and get paid for it. Like there's not a day that goes by that I don't sit here sometimes and go, why?
Well, I would definitely say any designer out there, we go through some form of imposter syndrome or self-doubt, at any given time. I mean, I recall back in architecture school, you go up for a critique. You're getting a critique by professors and sometimes other architects or people that have never met you till that day, and they're going to give you input. And sometimes it's not the nicest input. It is we don't understand your project at all. And you're just like, I literally spent 6 weeks on this and you're telling me you don't understand it. Like, I mean, it just gives you that doubt in things. But I will say the fulfilling part of my job is when I work with, like I said, a developer or a specific client. They come in and we work through with them and do that schematic design and lay out the office, talk through their ideas. And then when we actually then pull that together and they see the finished product, that is the fulfilling moment for me, because I'm there on site with them doing the final walkthrough, and they're just blown away many times. Just the idea of like, wow, I can't believe this is what it looks like. And I know you showed us views from your 3D program, which, like I said, Revit that I was mentioning earlier. We can pull 3D views and show them the idea of what it's going to look like, but for the common person to actually see it actually built, that's when it actually comes together for them, because their brain doesn't think like mine. My brain tends to think 2D versus 3D at times, and it even in some cases works like an engineer, and it starts to break apart how things would have been assembled for wall assemblies. Even down to details of components in systems. I dealt with a multi-floor, it was a extruding system, basically for a packaging plant. And I mean, we're talking like they did specialized packaging that then companies use to actually package their goods with. And 5 stories. It was in the building originally was for a concrete mixing plant, this 5-story tower. And we were cutting out the middle portions of that building, and the equipment was coming from Germany. And while the engineers in Germany were designing the system, I was even just wowed by like, wait a minute, this is what it's going to look like, and kind of digging in. But at the same time, I'm also coordinating things like, where's the mezzanines hit? Do we got to remove additional walls? Like, is there a clearance issue here for head height? Like, because you don't think about it, but having 2 floors and then have a mezzanine that comes in here, you might hit your head on something if you're not careful. So there's all kinds of coordination. But yes, imposter syndrome is an issue. I also recall licensing exam is 6 different exams right now for architects at this moment in time. That is the current ARE architecture registration exam. That's the current format. They test you on everything from practice management, project management, the different stages of design and drawing creation, down to construction administration. 3 exams I passed no time ago, no issue. 2 of them specifically, I had to do retakes. I believe both of those were one-time retaking. I have one that was the bane of my existence, and I had to retake that 3 additional times to pass. Oof. And I every time studying, it didn't matter if it was the one that it was a first time pass and go or the multiple time. It coming up into the week of getting ready to test take, I doubt it. I'm like, what am I doing? I don't know this stuff, and like I'm going through my flashcards, getting them right, but the whole time I'm just like, I can't learn all this. I don't know this. I'll never be an architect. Yada yada yada. And I mean, it happens. All of us go through it. I think that the key is what do you take from that moment and use it to actually learn to do better? I kind of chopped that up a little, coming from my head to my mouth here. But really, you you're in that moment, you have that self-doubt, that imposter syndrome, like, what am I doing? How am I even getting paid for this? And you're so fearful of what, like, this makes no sense to me. And it's just that self-doubt. If you can take that moment in time, that self-doubt, figure out why you have that self-doubt, and then move that into something for future use. When you start to doubt yourself in the future about something else, you can be like, wait a minute, this is stupid. You know, I'm already doing X, Y, and Z. Just cut it out, get to the chase, and move on.
I love it. Using it as a learning experience. I think that's a really powerful way to do it. And I think it definitely takes training your mind to think that way about it and not get lost in that self-doubt.
Yes, and it still hits me, you know, heading into the new position I'm going into now. You know, I'm going from a project architect to a senior project architect. The big difference in my position, there's the possibility of some people I'm going to be managing that would be potentially under me in a organizational structure. You know, the self-doubt. I have 3 years been in the Boy Scouts, played sports. I've dealt with leadership roles, things like that. And yet it still hits me of, I haven't really led anybody in 10 plus years. Can I do this? And I'm just there thinking, you know, it wasn't until my wife points out to me, she's like, you do everything else. You're just now telling people to do it. And like when she said that, it's like, oh, well, yeah, you're right. Why am I even doubting myself on this? You know?
That's awesome. Well, you hit all 3 levels too, man. Like in your explanation, you said when you're starting, it was great because your classes and the certifications and the tests helped give you that validation of, hey, wait a minute, I do know at least a little something. But then as you started doing better, you're like, no. When I see clients see that my work is awesome, that also helps me realize that I'm not just faking it. And then the third one is your wife. Like, nah, man, I've seen you recognize you're awesome. I've seen your clients see you're awesome. I've seen your exams. You're fine. But it still takes all of those. And that's with 12 years of experience doing it. And it's so funny that you say it that way. Great question, Ryan. I love that one. I always love that one.
What's the last big thing that you've done that you're proud of? And how was the data involved? Like, was there, you know, a certain calculation? Was there a certain code you were able to hit even though you weren't trying? Is there something you're really proud of that you want to share with anybody who's out there listening?
I would say right now the project I'm most proud of, and it was a shame I actually had to leave it before it's completely done. But it was the Madison, Wisconsin project I was working on this developer with. And Rob, I kind of told you a little bit about it in daily passings here and there, but to tell everybody else, is a project that this developer was trying to do commercial real estate, and they were purchasing land from an existing landowner to create this master site plan. And it was something that the zoning administration had never really thought of doing within the city. I guess is a nice way of saying it. And we received instant pushback. And I mean, it took almost 1.5 years of us fighting back and forth with zoning and planning and all these other players in this to actually get everything approved. But I mean, what I was proud that came out of it was the idea that the spreadsheet, like I said, that broke down every little parcel of land that was part of this, the 3 phases and now 2 phases for this, that, like I said, compared all the basic data that they cared about. On the flip side, I had site sketches I had to pull together. So everything from showing that, you know, here's the property boundaries that we're acquiring from the landowner. Here's the property we're giving away. Okay, here's what the 3 buildings theoretically are going to look like, you know, as close as we can get it, you know, just kind of boxing in a building, showing the parking, showing estimated numbers so we can get initial zoning approval. But even down to, we were having to put arrows on these to actually say, this is how truck traffic would move through here theoretically. Here is your future bicycle path on this roadway if residences ever come in. Like we even had to pre-plan where all of the bicycle racks were going for this. You know, and this is something like, as an architect, that within LEED and other green and wellness certifications, there is bicycle racks that's required, but not to this extent. You know, it's typically like, you know, 1 per every 10 employees minimum. This up front, we had to plan 1 bike rack for every 2,000 square foot of building to be put in. And they had specific stall requirements and a loading, we'll say an entry loading, unloading zone requirement. But then we then had to negotiate with them on behalf of the owner how many we would be willing to provide up front, because the owner's like, in this case, it was like 80 some bike stalls. The owner's like, I don't want to pay for 80 some bike stalls. What's the odds that they're going to get used? Basically, that's where we came in on behalf of the owner and just kind of negotiated with the city, and finally end up, it's like 24 or 26 bike stalls is what's going to be provided up front.
But you have room for what you need later, and you're happy, and everybody.
Exactly.
And you're able to see it in the spreadsheet, know everything's checked off, not wonder if you're leaving the houses unchecked.
Exactly. And with it being pre-planned, we got the city to agree that the pavers at the bike stall areas were going to be permeable, so it wouldn't count against us on green space requirement. So there is that side of it too. Very intensive process. It's something that I never thought that side of architecture would take so long. But for me, I have an interest in the idea of architect as developer, in which basically I would be my own client potentially down the road. And it's perfect exposure to me, because if I would choose to go that route later, or through a partnership even with a future company, you're then going to have to then take what not just I know, but also the pro formas and all the other budget analysis that the developers do to then figure out feasibility for these sites. And I mean, just to throw out numbers here, so some of these developers land-wise, I mean, we're talking excess of $4, $5, $10 million in some cases for these land purchases. Capital development for this stuff can be, I mean, upwards of 15 to 20 in some cases. And by capital developments, I mean roads, infrastructures, utilities. And
Things
this
you
is
don't
stuff,
care about for owning the land, like stuff you can't sell to people. You can't.
Things that you need to upgrade because you're going to build on that land, and now other people get to benefit from your upgrade. Yep. That's the other thing to keep in mind. So in some of these cases, developers, that while they do tend to get a bad rap, what I have found is they do often still spend a lot more money to do capital developments that allows the apartment building that 2 years later goes in across the street. It provided that additional water service up front so that could happen.
I'm sitting over here just trying to absorb just how much like data and information you sift through for each one of these projects, man. You never think about that, Growing up as an architect, I'm like a guy who draws buildings and then somebody else builds them.
Exactly, right? Exactly. Exactly. That's the rap they get.
Well, and I mean, honestly, most people, they're like, oh, you just draw buildings all day. No, I draw buildings maybe 30% of my time. Majority of my time is everything else.
Yeah, it sounds like your job is a lot more administrative than a lot of people let on.
And honestly, for your viewers, if all you want to do is draw buildings every day, you're probably not going to become a licensed architect. You're going to be a drafts person. I mean it, because those are the ones that only do drawing buildings all day. But I will say the difference is, as an architect, because we know all these codes, we know the ins and outs and deal directly with the clients. It allows us that experience to be able to actually design the buildings for the client and not just take red lines or markups on a drawing set and revise them.
I think that's awesome. I think there's people who definitely want to think about architecture. What's funny, dude, and we could have a whole other conversation about it. I give architects all kinds of grief when I say I'm a data architect. They're like, yeah, but not a real one. And I'm like, I don't know, man. Because when you talk about what I got to do for data architecture, I've got to go all across the business. I've got to know all the servers. I've got to know every system that generates data. I got to know how it generates data and who touches it between when it's there. And it's just so funny to hear you say all the same stuff. And I was like drawing parallels all the way through. But I have you to lean on, right? Like I have architects who do this kind of stuff that are just lean on. And what's so funny is so much of the stuff you said, I feel like I do. Like I thought I would just get to write code because I'm a consultant and I go sit and write awesome code all day. Nah, man, maybe 30% of my time's code. Like the majority is making sure that the 4 people at top are actually getting the right thing built, and that the 3 people at the bottom are able to get it out the right way. And really, it's taking those people who are going to deal with it on the daily and getting their needs met. Just like you're talking about, the person who lives in the house is the one you're worried about, or the person who lives in the community. I'm like, who's going to live in this data system and have to be responsible for promoting people based off of it? Should they? It's so cool to just hear all those things you talked about today, man. Thank you so much.
Yes.
So we're going to take a second here and put you on the spot just one more time, Travis.
Okay.
Go ahead and take a second here to shout out anything you want to, whether you want to point us at your social media, a project you're working on, a website, a charity. You've got the floor to advertise whatever you want here.
Okay. So if you want to find me, I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, Travis Kyle Miller. I use my full name. Also, I am on Discord. So, hit me up there. I would say if you have any questions on what architects do, especially if you're a young person, not sure about the profession, want to know more, even if you want to know a little bit more on the engineering side, hit me up. If I don't know, I usually have a contact that I can point you that would know. But with that being said, us architects, it's something that while we do a lot with data and stuff, I do still want to drive the point home. We are very client-focused people. It is something where we all got into the service-based profession with the intent of doing better buildings. And I would say that while to some people it might just be a simple house remodel, to us it is a project that we love hand-holding, and we love helping you through the process. So definitely it's something. If you have any questions, never hurts to ask an architect. If we don't know, we can probably point you in direction. While some do residential architecture and they're very successful at it, like I said, the bulk of my experience has been commercial and real estate and businesses and restaurants and a little bit of everything in between. And it has been a very fulfilling profession for me so far. Even with its downs, I still love to do it day in and day out.
That's awesome. Thank you again, Travis, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure getting to know a little bit about your involvement in data and how that affects your career, and a little bit of everything, honestly, because it sounds like you've been dealing with it since about as long as you could read.
Yes. And maybe in the future, Rob, once you kind of get a little bit more and we can discuss things data-wise and statistics that business owners or something can do. As architects, we see a lot on the research end of productivity results and a lot of information thrown our way from different products being tested in the market, and how it improves, not just workplace, but performance, employee and enjoyment and performance for that matter, down to, how does one fill in a space? Even just cutting in a skylight sometimes can just change the difference. There's all kinds of things. So, maybe future discussions to be had, but I wish you all well. And I thank you all for having me on here.
Thank you much. Thank you, Ryan, for helping wrangle this herd of cats.
No, it was
Thanks,
a pleasure.
Dave Barlow, for editing it.
It was really good, Travis. It was really interesting, man. Like I said, my perception of architecture has changed fundamentally after listening to you for this last hour. So, and a lot of the things you said resonated with me really big. Like I've always been very client focused when I do my work, and customer service is one of my favorite places to be in, and project management and the business admin side of it and all of those things you're talking about. It feels like it's right up my alley, man. It feels more like home than my job now, to be honest with you.
Yes.
So that's really awesome, man. Thank you for your time today. It was really, really interesting. I learned a lot.
Thank you all.
Have a good one,
Have
Travis.
a good one.
Thank you for joining Podcast Like a Business on our journey to discover just how everything is data. If you want to watch the next episode or one of our favorites, click on the thumbnails here for more Podcast Lab, and find us wherever you like to listen to podcasts.